The king who meant order. In the oldest layers of Egyptian belief, Osiris is often presented like a perfect ruler, calm, steady, legitimate. Not the kind of king who wins by brute force, but the kind who wins because life works better when he's in charge. Osiris becomes connected to what Egyptians valued most: stability, justice, the steady rhythm of nature. The Nile floods, the fields grow green, the grain rises, people eat, society holds together, the world makes sense. And because ancient Egypt saw the universe as a balance between forces, between harmony and disruption, Osiris naturally becomes a symbol of that harmony. But in myths, harmony isn't something you get once and keep forever, it's something you defend. And that's where the tension begins. Because alongside Osiris exists another powerful figure, Set. Set is often tied to storms, deserts, and upheaval, things that can be necessary, even sacred, but also dangerous when they spill out of bounds. In some traditions, Set isn't a cartoon villain, he's a force, a pressure in the system. But even forces can become rivals. And Set doesn't want Osiris on the throne. He wants the throne empty. Or better yet, he wants it for himself. Love, rivalry, and fate. Osiris isn't alone in this story. He's part of a divine network, almost like a mythic family drama where every relationship has cosmic consequences. Osiris is paired with Isis, a goddess famous for intelligence, devotion, and above all, magic. Isis isn't just a supportive spouse in the background. In this myth, she is the engine that keeps the story moving when everything else collapses. Set is often linked with Nephthys, who in many versions is her sister. And these connections matter, because the story isn't only about a murder. It's about what happens when a family fractures, when jealousy and ambition turn into something irreversible. And behind all of them, hanging like a shadow that hasn't arrived yet, is Horus, Osiris's future son, the heir who will one day challenge Set. But before Horus can fight, Osiris has to fall. The banquet and the box. Set doesn't attack Osiris in open battle, that would be too simple. Instead, he sets a trap. A banquet is arranged: music, food, laughter, a gathering that looks like celebration. And at the center of this feast, Set unveils a beautiful object, an ornate chest, a box crafted to perfection. Set announces a game. He says the chest will be a gift, free for whoever fits inside it perfectly. One by one, guests try: too tall, too short, too wide, too narrow. And then Osiris steps forward. Because Osiris, the rightful king, has no reason to fear a party trick. He lies down inside the chest. And in the blink of an eye, the joke snaps shut. The lid slams down, the box is sealed, locked, nailed. Osiris, king, god, symbol of order, is suddenly reduced to silence inside a coffin-shaped prison. And Set does the one thing that turns this from betrayal into myth. He throws the chest into the river. The Nile carries it away. And with it, the world's balance goes with it too. Because Osiris isn't just gone. He's been removed from the living world itself. A world without Osiris. Imagine what this means in a culture that believed the health of the land was tied to sacred order. When Osiris disappears, it isn't only a throne that's threatened. It's the rhythm of life. It's the sense that things are in their rightful place. Set takes advantage of that absence, because chaos doesn't always arrive as a monster. Sometimes it arrives as an empty seat of authority, a missing center, and the slow unraveling that follows. But Isis does not accept this. She does what myths often ask their heroes to do. She refuses to stop moving. While others mourn, Isis searches. She becomes something more than a goddess of motherhood or magic. She becomes a seeker, a hunter of what should not be lost. And the search begins. Isis searches the world. Isis travels. She questions, she listens to whispers, she follows rumor and wind and river current. In some versions of the story, the chest drifts out of Egypt, carried by water beyond familiar land. It reaches foreign shores, where it becomes caught in a tree. The tree grows around it, swallowing it into wood, as if nature itself tries to hide the crime. And the tree, beautiful and fragrant, is cut down and turned into a pillar in a royal palace. Osiris, still trapped, becomes literally part of architecture, a hidden corpse inside the foundation of someone else's kingdom. But Isis finds him, because in this myth, devotion is a kind of supernatural compass. She arrives, she reveals herself, she retrieves the chest, and she brings Osiris back toward home. And for a moment, it feels like the story might end there. Like the body is recovered, the loss is undone, the world can return to normal. But myth rarely allows a clean ending, because Set is not finished. The second crime discovers that Isis has retrieved Osiris. And this is where the myth becomes more than a murder story. It becomes an explanation for ritual, for burial, for why Egyptians cared so deeply about keeping a body whole. Set doesn't simply kill Osiris again. He destroys the possibility of restoration. He takes Osiris's body and tears it apart, scattering the pieces across the land. Not just hiding the body, fragmenting it. Turning the king into a puzzle. Turning grief into a map. This is the moment where the story becomes cruel in a very specific way. Set isn't only trying to remove Osiris, he's trying to make him impossible. Because a scattered body is a scattered identity, a scattered legacy, a scattered hope. But Isis, again, refuses to stop. And she is not alone. In many traditions, Nephthys joins her, as if even those tied to Set can recognize the horror of what has been done. Together they begin the work of gathering. Not revenge, not war, gathering, piece by piece, across the land, across the reeds and sands, across the borders of what's humanly bearable. Because the goal isn't to punish Set yet. The goal is to make Osiris whole enough that he can become something new. Why wholeness mattered in Egypt. Before we go further, it helps to understand why gathering the body mattered so much in Egypt. For the Egyptians, a human being wasn't just one thing. The self had parts, different spiritual aspects that needed the right conditions to survive death. The body mattered because it was an anchor, a home base. So when later Egyptians practiced mummification, it wasn't just about preservation for the sake of appearance. It was about stability, continuity, making sure the person remained recognizable to themselves and to the gods. That's why the Osiris myth hits so hard. It's the ultimate threat to afterlife survival. Not just death, but disintegration. Not just ending, but scattering. Isis gathering the pieces isn't only an act of love. It's the first major mythic statement of a belief that wholeness can be restored and that restoration is sacred work. And once you understand that, what happens next feels less like fantasy and more like the foundation of an entire civilization's relationship with death. The first mummy and the miracle. Isis and her allies reassemble Osiris. They wrap him, they protect him. They speak words, magic words, names, spells, sacred language that turns grief into power. In many versions, one part cannot be found. Details vary depending on the tradition, but the point is consistent. Osiris is restored not to return to everyday life, but to cross a boundary. And here the myth offers its most famous miracle, because Isis does not simply resurrect Osiris in a normal sense. She restores him enough to conceive a child, Horus. This is not framed like an ordinary act, it's portrayed as something cosmic, a defiance of Set's attempt to end a lineage. Even in death, Osiris becomes a source of life. And Horus becomes the promise that the throne will not remain stolen forever. But Osiris does not stay as king of the living. His return is real, yet limited. He rises into a new role, a darker, deeper authority. Osiris becomes lord of the Duat, the realm beyond life. Not because he failed, but because someone must rule the place everyone fears. And who better than the god who has already traveled there and survived? Osiris enthroned in the underworld. This is where Osiris changes from dead king to king of the dead. In Egyptian thought, the afterlife is not just a cloudy nowhere, it's structured, it's navigable. if you have the knowledge, the protection, the right words, the right moral standing. Osiris becomes the central figure in this system. You might picture him seated on a throne, calm, eternal, often shown with regal symbols, the crook and flail, the crown, the posture of a ruler who will not be moved. Because Osiris represents permanence, and the underworld needs permanence. It needs rules. It needs judgment, which leads to one of the most iconic scenes in all Egyptian religion, the weighing of the heart. A person's heart, seen as the seat of character, is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and right order. The message is clear: what you do in life matters. Not because a god is petty, but because the universe itself is built on balance. And Osiris sits at the end of that process as the ruler who confirms what becomes of you. In a sense, Set's betrayal accidentally creates something enormous: a moral afterlife. Not perfect, not always equal, but structured. And for people facing death in a world of harsh deserts and unpredictable floods, structure is hope. A different kind of resurrection. It's worth pausing here because Osiris is one of the earliest and most influential examples of a dying and rising figure in world mythology, but Egypt's version has its own unique flavor. This isn't a story about escaping death forever. Osiris doesn't come back to resume daily life. He becomes the ruler of the realm where death is normal. That's an important difference. The myth doesn't promise that death disappears. It promises that death becomes meaningful, governed, named, mapped, and ultimately survivable in a spiritual sense. And that idea, death as a transition rather than a void, is why Osiris mattered to ordinary people, not just to priests and kings. Because if Osiris can be reassembled, then maybe you can be too. Why Egyptians loved this story. Now let's bring this back to Earth. Literally. Osiris isn't only a god of tombs, he's tied to life. Egyptians often linked him with fertility and vegetation. The land goes dry, then the flood comes, and the fields return green. Grain is buried as seed and dies in the soil, then rises again. So the Osiris story becomes a cosmic echo of what people watched every year: loss, return, renewal. And it also becomes a political idea. Pharaohs were often associated with Horus while alive, the living heir, the divine king on earth. And in death, the king could be linked to Osiris, joining the ruler of the dead. So the cycle becomes Horus on the throne in life, Osiris in the underworld in death. A continuous chain that says Egypt's order doesn't end when one person dies. It transfers. It continues. And that continuity is everything. Because Set's great threat isn't only murder. It's rupture. The end of the chain. The snapping of the system. And Osiris, through Isis, restoration, and Horus, birth, becomes the proof that rupture can be repaired. The next war begins. By the time Osiris takes his throne in the Duat, the story isn't over. It's shifted. Osiris is now the authority behind the scenes, the king you can't see, but whose court you will eventually enter. And Horus, raised in secrecy in some versions, protected by Isis, becomes the living challenge to Set. The conflict between Horus and Set becomes one of the most famous divine struggles in Egyptian mythology. Not just a battle for a chair, but a battle over what kind of world Egypt will be. Will it be a world where betrayal wins? Or a world where rightful order returns? And crucially, Osiris doesn't have to swing a weapon to win. His victory is that he becomes unavoidable. Set can take the throne of the living for a time, but he cannot erase the fact that death now has a king. A judge. A ruler who has already endured what Set tried to do. How people face the unknown. There's also a deeper psychological reason this story sticks. Most myths about death focus on fear, monsters, punishments, darkness. Osiris adds something different: administration. The afterlife becomes a court, a process, a set of steps. And that's exactly how human beings often cope with the unknown, by turning chaos into something with names and procedures. Osiris doesn't remove the terror of death. He domesticates it. He makes it something you can prepare for with prayers, with rituals, with a moral life, with remembrance. In that sense, the Osiris myth is not just ancient religion. It's an ancient strategy for courage, a way of looking into the abyss and saying, this too has a structure. The king beyond death. So what is Osiris in the end? He's the murdered king, the restored body, the first mummy in myth, the source of an heir, and the ruler of a realm that every living person must face. Osiris doesn't come back to pretend death didn't happen. He comes back to prove that death is not meaningless, that even betrayal can be turned into order, that even in the underworld a throne can exist and justice can sit on it. And maybe that's why this story lasted for thousands of years. Because it doesn't promise that you won't break. It promises that broken things can be gathered, named, wrapped, remembered, and made whole enough to continue. Osiris did not defeat death by escaping it. He defeated death by giving it a king. And once death has a king, it has rules. And if it has rules, then it can be faced.